Karen thought she was cutting off my water, like she ran the neighborhood. But here's the twist. I'm not even in the HOA. And the water line she sabotaged? It feeds their entire subdivision. She came for war and accidentally handed me control over every drop they drink, bathe in, and flush with. Now they're on my terms. Karen always had a reputation in the neighborhood, not for kindness, not for generosity, and definitely not for minding her own business. She carried herself like a self-appointed HOA marshal, even though her title was barely a formality and her understanding of the rules selective at best. What she lacked in authority, she made up for in volume and intimidation. And when she decided someone was out of line, it didn't matter what was legal, reasonable, or even true, only that her version of neighborhood order was enforced. So when she set her sights on a set of exposed pipes along the edge of my property, she saw an opportunity, not to ask, not to clarify, but to attack. According to her, the pipes were an eyesore, a violation of HOA appearance standards, and not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. None of those statements were backed by anything factual, but that never stopped her before. She believed her tone alone could make things true, and when that didn't work, she took things into her own hands. Without notice, warning, or permission, Karen called in a local plumber. Not a city worker, not an HOA contractor, just a guy from the classifieds who clearly didn't ask too many questions. With a clipboard in one hand and tools in the other, he followed her straight onto my property like she had every legal right to be there. She pointed, he nodded, and together they approached the pipe system I had installed years before the HOA was even incorporated. The line wasn't flashy or broken. It was simply visible, functional, and completely, unequivocally mine. She waved her arm like a general commanding troops. Moments later, the saw came out. Then the wrench. Then the cracking sound of a pipe being forcibly separated from its connection. Water burst in a narrow stream, then slowed to a trickle. My supply line was cut, just like that. No hearing, no citation, no dialogue. Just sabotage disguised as enforcement. But what Karen didn't understand, what she never bothered to check, was the simple fact that these pipes didn't just supply my house. They were part of a larger, legally grandfathered system that I had once agreed to let the developer tap into. Years ago, before the neighborhood filled up with cul-de-sacs and HOA regulations, I was approached with a proposal: allow the extension of my well-based water system to service the community during its development phase. In return, I received an easement agreement, compensation, and, most importantly, written proof that I retained full control over the originating line. The HOA knew this. At least the original board did. Whether Karen ever read those files is doubtful. More likely, she saw something she didn't like, made up a rule to match her mood, and acted like a sheriff laying down the law. But in cutting my supply line, she disrupted the entire chain. What started as a drip in my backyard turned into a cascade of issues across the subdivision. Homeowners on the western loop began reporting drops in pressure. Lawn sprinklers stuttered. Outdoor fountains gasped and whined. And then it spread. Showers lost pressure, faucets sputtered, and within hours, complaints flooded the HOA group chat. No one knew the source. No one understood why. But it had everything to do with one pipe, one bad decision, and one person's arrogance. Karen, of course, played dumb. When questioned, she claimed she approved minor landscaping corrections. She said she had the right to request improvements. And when pressed further, she doubled down, insisting the pipe wasn't up to HOA code, even though it wasn't subject to HOA code at all. But it was too late. The damage was done, not just to infrastructure, but to credibility. Cutting a pipe is one thing. Cutting one tie to the neighborhood's primary water pressure line is another. The irony? In trying to silence what she saw as an eyesore, Karen had unwittingly exposed a hidden truth. I controlled something far bigger than she ever imagined. The very supply her community relied on ran through land that had never been, and could, never be, subject to her authority. This wasn't about a pipe, it was about control. And in trying to flex her imagined power, Karen had handed me the very proof I needed to show just how little power she ever had. This was no longer just a neighborhood spat. This was a turning point, because now the HOA wasn't just on the wrong side of the rules. They were dependent on the one person they tried to silence, and Karen had just turned off the tap for all of them. Long before the HOA ever existed, before its bylaws, meetings, or self-appointed enforcers like Karen, the land stood quiet. It was raw, undeveloped, and legally mine. When I purchased the property, there was no association, just wide-open land and the opportunity to build something permanent. I installed my own infrastructure from the ground up, including a deep-bored private well and a water line that ran across my acreage for personal use. There were no restrictions, no shared easements, and no other properties in sight. Years later, the developers arrived with big ideas and bigger ambitions. They wanted to turn this rural pocket into a suburban enclave, dozens of lots, streetlights, sidewalks, a clubhouse, and of course, an HOA to govern it all. During construction, they needed water, lots of it, for concrete mixing, landscaping, and utilities. Their own infrastructure wasn't finished, so they approached me, respectfully, professionally, with a proposal in hand. They asked if they could tap into my water system temporarily while building. The offer came with signed agreements, compensation for usage, insurance coverage for liabilities, and most importantly, acknowledgement that the supply line remained my private asset. It was never transferred, never sold, and never relinquished. I agreed, not because I needed the money, but because cooperation made sense at the time. The terms were clear. Access could be extended through my property for construction, and any permanent connection required my approval. That approval was never formally granted, but construction didn't stop, and over time the temporary connection became a permanent dependency. The HOA formed, houses filled in, pipes were extended, valves were added, and meters were quietly installed. No one asked to change the agreement. No one renegotiated terms. They simply built on top of what I had provided, assuming, wrongly, that they could treat it as theirs. Legally, that mistake was monumental. The original easement was still valid and unchallenged. It specifically stated that I retained full rights over the source and supply, that my property was not subject to future HOA restrictions, that any interference with the water system without written consent constituted trespass and civil liability. These weren't casual terms. They were notarized and recorded in the county archives. Karen and her board either never read them or believed they no longer mattered, but they mattered more than ever now. Because the HOA had not only failed to secure their own infrastructure, they had built their community on top of mine. Every drop of water that reached their pipes passed through my land. Every flush, every sprinkler system, every faucet was silently powered by the system I had agreed to loan but never surrender. And the most astonishing part? I never paid a single cent in HOA dues, never signed their agreement, never accepted their jurisdiction. The HOA had always excluded my property from its reach, both geographically and contractually. I was outside their boundaries, outside their rules, and yet, I held the key to one of their most essential services. Karen's stunt hadn't just crossed a line, it had revealed how dangerously dependent they were on infrastructure they didn't own or control. By ordering the plumber to cut into my line, she had committed unauthorized entry and tampering. And in doing so, she exposed the board to legal consequences they hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the balance of power shifted. I wasn't just a neighbor they didn't like. I was the landowner their entire community unknowingly relied on. This wasn't some abstract leverage. It was black and white, on paper, in official records. And now, with the water supply disrupted, that leverage was real, tangible, provable. My phone started ringing. First, concerned residents asking if I'd noticed the pressure drop. Then board members pretending they didn't know what happened. Then finally, silence. The kind of silence that only comes when people realize they're out of their depth. Karen, meanwhile, stayed quiet, likely hoping no one would connect the dots. But the plumber's invoice, the time-stamped security footage, and the damaged piping were all evidence, not just of incompetence, but of outright interference. She hadn't just picked a fight. She had activated a clause in my easement agreement, one that allowed me to revoke access without notice in the event of tampering. And now, legally, I could shut the whole system down. There was no board vote that could override it, no emergency meeting that could undo it. The water they thought belonged to the HOA had always come with a condition. Don't mess with the source. Karen had failed that condition spectacularly. And the moment she did, she triggered a clause none of them even remembered existed. They may have ignored the paper trail, but the paper never stopped being real. And now, so were the consequences. The first signs were subtle. A couple of homeowners complaining about low water pressure in the neighborhood chat. A few texts about sprinklers not turning on. Karen brushed them off, suggesting it was a seasonal issue or maybe a faulty controller. But within hours, the signs became unmistakable. The clubhouse pool didn't just slow to a trickle. It drained halfway down before the autofill shut off. Lawn irrigation systems across the community ground to a halt. Toilets began, struggling to flush. Faucets sputtered, coughed, and eventually gave up entirely. By the time Karen's own kitchen tap started hissing with nothing but air, she could no longer pretend it wasn't serious. She called it a temporary glitch, told everyone a maintenance team had been dispatched, but no team was coming, because no one on the board even knew where to begin. The infrastructure they depended on wasn't theirs. And the one person who did know how it worked, they had just tried to cut out of the equation entirely. Calls started pouring in. Residents furious about the silence, about the total lack of transparency. Parents with young kids couldn't bathe them. Seniors were panicking about medication routines that depended on running water. Entire homes became dysfunctional overnight. And when people demanded answers at the emergency board meeting, Karen had none. She stammered through vague excuses about a disruption in the main line and contractor errors, never once mentioning that she herself had given the order to tamper with the only water supply feeding the entire development. Behind closed doors, panic set in. The HOA board scrambled through old paperwork and maps, searching for some kind of backup plan or emergency bypass system. They found nothing, because none had ever been built. The original agreement for temporary access had never been updated or expanded. There were no contingencies, no rights of way, no secondary pipelines. All they had was what I had allowed them to use. And now, after Karen's power trip, that goodwill was gone. I didn't have to say a word. The neighborhood group chat started, doing the work for me. Residents shared screenshots of Karen boasting in previous threads about taking control of community infrastructure. Someone leaked the plumber's invoice with her signature. Then a neighbor close to the board forwarded an email showing Karen had dismissed warnings from another member about tampering with privately held lines. The narrative turned quickly. Karen wasn't a hero trying to clean up a messy system. She was the reason it collapsed. By the next day, local news picked it up. Water crisis in gated community traced to HOA dispute, the headline read. Reporters started circling. Residents were filmed hauling bottled water from their cars. An elderly couple had to relocate temporarily to their daughter's house because their home wasn't livable without water. Even the board members who had once backed Karen began to distance themselves, saying they didn't authorize the pipe interference and had no knowledge of the legal situation with my land. The worst part for Karen? Her own house sat on the part of the system furthest from the original supply. She was hit the hardest. By day 3, she was boiling bottled water to wash dishes, fielding non-stop complaints, and ducking calls from residents threatening legal action against the HOA for negligence and damages. Everything she thought she controlled had slipped out from under her in a matter of hours. But the real reckoning was still to come. Because I hadn't just remained silent, I had documented everything. Every message, every board communication. I was CC'd on from years ago, every easement clause, every meter installed on my land without renegotiation. The timeline was crystal clear. The HOA had overstepped, and Karen had gone rogue. And now, with the entire neighborhood turning on her, I was about to present the one thing they all feared: proof that the system failure wasn't a freak accident. It was sabotage, ordered by someone who didn't even know the consequences of her own actions. The illusion of control Karen had clung to was gone. No more fake authority, no more micromanaging, just a broken board, a furious community, and a very real threat of lawsuits. People weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. And as the truth unraveled in group chats, meetings, and emergency notices pinned to mailboxes, it became clear that Karen's time on the board wasn't just ending, it was about to explode. In full public disgrace. What she didn't realize yet was that I wasn't done. Not even close. Because while the water had stopped flowing through their pipes, something far more dangerous had started circulating through the neighborhood. The truth. Once I had gathered everything I needed, signed easement records, time-stamped, photos, old email trails, and the plumber's assessment, I made the call that would change the game. I didn't call to negotiate. I didn't call to warn. I called to inform. The HOA president picked up, and I laid it all out with the kind of cold precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. I explained that I legally owned the parcel through which the HOA's entire water system flowed. I explained that any past access the HOA had enjoyed was provisional, based on mutual trust, not a formal agreement. That trust had been destroyed when Karen ordered unauthorized damage to my infrastructure. And now, with the water line intentionally compromised and the community in crisis, I was well within my rights to shut down all flow until restitution was made. I wasn't asking. I was telling. There was silence on the other end. Then stammering. He asked if we could talk this out. I told him we were already doing that, and my terms were crystal clear. Karen would personally pay for every cent of damage, both to the pipe and the surrounding system. She would step down from her position on the HOA board, and she would issue a formal written apology to me and to the residents for reckless misconduct and abuse of power. Until then, the water stayed off. Panic started spreading faster than the drought. Emergency meetings were called. Board members scrambled for options, but there were none. They had no leverage. They couldn't go around me, and they couldn't fabricate an alternate supply line in time to avoid a full-blown health crisis. They were stuck. Residents flooded the neighborhood forums. This wasn't just some petty back and forth anymore. It had become a disaster of the board's own making. The same people who once blindly followed Karen's every directive were now calling for her resignation. The silence from her end only made things worse. She had vanished from the chats, ignored direct calls, and even skipped the emergency HOA meeting. Her allies, once so vocal, were now frantically backpedaling, insisting they had no idea what she'd done. But the receipts didn't lie. Her digital fingerprints were all over the order to cut into the line. Her name was on the service. Request. Her messages, once smug and condescending, were now being reposted with captions mocking her downfall. The residents weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. Families with no water for 3 days were demanding refunds, legal recourse, even criminal charges. What started as a power play had erupted into a mutiny, and through it all, I stayed calm. I didn't need to raise my voice or make threats. I just made sure the facts kept circulating. I sent residents clean copies of the original land deed, showing how the HOA had never officially secured water rights. I shared photos of the damage done to my property, and when a few board members tried to claim I was being unreasonable, I posted the repair estimate, over $11,000, and reminded them that they had no insurance coverage for illegal tampering. The neighborhood began to shift its tone. People who had once scoffed at me now posted things like, "He's not wrong." And honestly, I'd do the same in his shoes. Sympathy swung in my direction, not because I asked for it, but because I had the receipts, the calm, and the leverage. Meanwhile, the board was scrambling to hold on to what little credibility it had left. By day 4, the president called again. His tone had changed. This time he asked what it would take to restore water. I repeated my terms: full payment, public apology, Karen's resignation, nothing less. And this time, he didn't argue. He said he'd bring it to the board for a vote. I said they had until the end of the day. Behind the scenes, I knew what was happening. Karen had become a liability. The board was ready to throw her under the bus to save themselves. They weren't loyal, they were opportunistic. And now, survival meant cutting her loose. By sunset, the HOA sent out a mass email to the entire community. It was a formal statement, hastily written and dripping with desperation. Karen had voluntarily stepped down pending internal review. The board would fully cooperate with the property owner, me, to repair damages and restore services. And they would evaluate new guidelines for infrastructure oversight. They didn't mention the apology, but I didn't need it to come from the board. Because attached to the bottom of the email, like a scarlet letter, was Karen's own statement. She called it a personal apology to the residents and property owner. She claimed she had acted without full understanding of the legal boundaries. She accepted full responsibility. It was a carefully worded climb down, but it was still a public humiliation. I didn't gloat. I just gave the green light to begin repairs. Water flowed again that evening. Faucets hissed back to life. And while the residents got their basic needs restored, Karen had lost everything she thought made her powerful. And I wasn't finished. Because when you burn bridges in a system you don't control, don't be surprised when you're left stranded. The days following the repair work were tense, to say the least. The HOA had been scrambling to manage the damage caused by their careless interference with my plumbing system. At first, I thought I'd have to deal with their usual evasive tactics, the fake apologies, the "we'll look into it" responses, and the slow grind of bureaucracy. But this time, I wasn't going to play by their rules. I knew that the power dynamics between the homeowners and the HOA had always been tilted in their favor. They dictated the rules. They enforced the fines. They had control over everything, from the landscaping to the most intimate details of our properties. The situation with my pipes had exposed that imbalance for what it was, a constant reminder that the HOA believed they could do whatever they wanted without any real consequences. Well, that was about to change. After the repair work was done and the contractor left, I stood in front of the house, inspecting the pipes that had once been cut into without a second thought. This wasn't just about the damage to my property anymore. This was about taking back control. They'd messed with the wrong person, and now it was my turn to flip the script. I spent the next few days putting the plan into motion. It wasn't just about fixing the pipes. It was about making sure they'd never forget who was really in charge here. I'd seen the power they held, and I knew exactly how to turn that power on its head. If they thought they could control the homeowners by holding all the cards, it was time to deal them a new hand. I called in a professional plumber to install a master shutoff valve, a lockable one. It was a strategic move, one that would give me the upper hand every time the HOA came calling. The system would allow me to control the water supply to the entire street. It wasn't illegal, and it wasn't even malicious. It was just smart, practical thinking. If they were going to meddle with my property, I was going to make sure they knew who had the final say when it came to the water running through their pipes. As soon as the valve was installed, I immediately made a plan for how to leverage it. I charged the HOA a hefty service fee for access to the valve. I wasn't doing this for the money, at least not primarily. This was about sending a message. Every time they needed to access that water, they'd have to come to me, hat in hand, asking permission. And every time they asked, I'd make sure they remembered that it was me who controlled the flow. The HOA's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. At first, they tried to ignore me, hoping I'd just go away. But when the water to the entire block was cut off, they had no choice but to face the reality of what I had done. The calls started coming in, one after another. Each one was a reminder of how much power I now held. They wanted me to fix things. They wanted me to unlock the valve and let the water flow freely again, but I wasn't going to make it that easy for them. I'd waited long enough for them to learn their lesson, and now I wanted to make sure they never forgot who they were dealing with. I had them sign a service agreement before I would grant access to the valve, stipulating not only a service fee but also a clause that required them to respect the boundaries of my property in the future. They signed it without complaint, their lawyer looking over every word as if they had no other option but to comply. I could hear the frustration in their voices, but that only made it sweeter. For once, I was the one in control. Then came the final act of this power play, the apology. Not from me, of course, but from the HOA. It wasn't heartfelt, and it certainly wasn't sincere. Their lawyer wrote up a carefully crafted statement that was about as genuine as a fake smile. They had to apologize, or I threatened to involve the media. There was no way they were going to let that happen. The HOA was desperate to save face, and I was the one holding the power to make sure they didn't completely implode. The letter of apology was posted on the HOA's website. It was as cold and legalistic as you could imagine, but it carried a weight that they couldn't hide. I'd made them bow to my demands, and they knew it. They'd been forced to publicly admit their mistake, and they had no choice but to accept my terms. They had tried to break me, to control me, but instead I had turned the tables. The HOA was now a shadow of its former self in my neighborhood. They no longer had the same stranglehold over the residents. And whenever they needed water, whenever they turned on a tap, they'd be reminded that it was my decision whether they had access to it. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every homeowner who'd ever felt powerless, for every person who'd ever been bullied by an HOA that thought it could push people around. I had stood up to them, and in doing so, I'd given the entire neighborhood a glimpse of what could happen when you stop letting others control your fate. The next time the HOA thought they could walk all over someone, they'd have to think twice. Because now they knew. When it came to this neighborhood, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was the one who called the shots. If you've ever felt the frustration of being pushed around by your HOA, you're not alone. This story is just one example of how standing up for yourself can shift the power dynamic and make a real difference. But there's more where that came from. If you want to hear more wild, jaw-dropping HOA stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and join me on this journey as we uncover the truth behind HOA drama, one unbelievable story at a time.